Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is History 150, and this is episode 11, Republics. So, like Greece, war and geography determined government in Rome and determined the ideals of leadership. So, Rome was not an important place. It was not supposed to be an important place. There's nothing about Rome, geographically speaking, that makes it special. In fact, at the end of the Roman Empire, even the Roman emperors would leave Rome. Constantine would build Constantinople on a Greek town, Byzantium, where the Hellespont, where the Greece and Asia kind of met and were separated by a inlet into the Black Sea. That was far more politically important than Rome. Even the last of the last Western Roman emperors ended up near Venice, in Ravenna, up in the north. So Rome wasn't important, but it was surrounded. It was born surrounded by people that could have taken it over. The Gauls in the far north, who came from what we would call France today, they came over the mountains, probably at the behest as mercenaries of the Etruscans, but they settled in the north. And so there is no Italy in the earliest of early days. There's 4 different peoples who have divided up what we would call Italy today. And the Gauls are tougher than the Romans. And they're in the far north. In the central north are the Etruscans, who are clearly smarter than the Romans. The Romans will tell us that a lot of the stuff they learned how to do to build up a civilization, they learned from the Etruscans. The Greeks to their south were tougher and smarter. The Greeks would go on to conquer the Persian Empire, get rich, invent philosophy and all kinds of drama and arts. So the Greeks were tougher and smarter. And the Latins, of which Rome was just one city, were divided, weak, and poor. Rome was one small Latin city among 14 large Latin states, and they all fought each other all the time. The Greeks fought each other, the Latins fought each other, the Latins fought the Greeks, the Etruscans fought the Latins, the Gauls fought everybody. To survive, Rome had to fight all the time. They had to fight Latin neighbors. They had to fight Etruscan invasions. They had to fight Greek expansion. So from the very beginning, unlike in Greece, where men become citizens in joining the phalanx, the men are citizens from birth. And the men had to serve the state. From the very beginning, from the moment you're born, you have to serve the Roman state. Which means you also had to have a say. For Rome to survive, it had to give its citizens a say. And so the Roman Republic was born of trauma. Etruscan kings took over Rome and ruled it for 100 years. And you can imagine, Etruscan kings don't rule Rome very nicely. The Etruscans, they don't like Rome or the Romans, who are Latin. They're different people. And so the Etruscan kings were so tyrannical that the patricians, the richest families in Rome, the rich class, rebelled in 509 and kicked the kings out. They had a rebellion, but that also meant they couldn't have a king. The patrician lords were not going to let one of them declare themselves king because Etruscan kings were so tyrannical they couldn't have a king again. The United States is the same way. Having rebelled against the English king, there's nearly nobody, and there's no serious argument for having an American king. Like there's the idea that, Washington could have been king. He really couldn't have. Because Washington couldn't have been Washington if Washington wanted to become a king. Having thrown off the king for being tyrannical, they simply couldn't have another king. You couldn't even wear purple in Rome, which were the royal colors. The purple comes from a dye that the Phoenicians learned to make by crushing a special kind of snail, the shells of the snail. And so you could dye clothes to be purple, but it was so expensive that only the rich could wear it. So it became purple has become the color of kings, of emperors. But the patricians also didn't want a democracy, just like the American Republic. The rich people didn't really want to share power all that much. They had won themselves Rome. They didn't want to have a democracy, so Rome becomes a republic. It is never a democracy. Even though it has democratic institutions, it is never a democracy, meaning everyone gets the right to vote. Or more importantly, I can't say that because most men do end up with the right to vote because they will serve in the army and they're citizens. So excuse me, it's not a democracy because the assembly is never sovereign. The institutions of the patricians are always more important. But a republic is weird. Like, we had this fight a couple years ago, and I hear people be like, when arch conservatives are like, we're a republic, not a democracy. What they meant was, I don't have to share power with people. But then you get the people who say, oh, that's stupid. We are a democracy. No, we're not. We are a republic. And that's part of the problem. That's our institutions are Republican institutions in the United States. They're not democratic ones. So a republic is weird because it's technically a democracy. People get to vote. The people technically are sovereign. But they don't really have a say. I don't vote every day. I don't vote on every decision. I don't even get to vote on the big ones, like going to war, or what my taxes are going to be, or what the laws are going to be. I vote for a representative who then makes all those decisions for me in my name, in the name of the people. But the patricians felt they had a right to run the place. They were the rich. They didn't trust the plebeians, the workers, the farmers. They said, you're not trained. You don't know what to do. But the plebeians were essential to the army, especially after they had a sit-down strike in 450 BC. The plebeians, there was a war, and basically the plebeians were called out, and they sat down. And the patricians went, but we're at war. And the plebeians said, we didn't vote for a war. You're at war. And the patricians said, but our enemy is coming and they're going to take your stuff. And the plebeians said, we're poor. We don't have stuff. They're coming to take your stuff. And so the patricians were like, uh-oh, they're out of luck. So the patricians said, what do you want? And the plebeians said, you know how the laws treat you really well and give you all kinds of rights? And they said, yeah, we love that. The plebeians said, yeah, I know. We want that too. You mean you want to be equal to the rich people? Yes, we want to be equal to the rich people. We want the law to treat everyone equally. And the patricians said, okay. So people got a right to vote. They got the right to have the say. They got tribunes, representatives. They never get an assembly because it's going to be a republic and not a democracy. So the patricians were able to negotiate that there's not an assembly. But the people got representatives, and those representatives got to have a veto. And the veto is technically more of a poll. It's more of saying, if you do this, the people are going to revolt and burn down Rome. So you can't pass this law. The people will be too angry. So a republic is weird. It is a bunch of people, mostly rich people, running a government. They say they are running in the name of the people, but then they don't ask the people very often what the people want. I have lived a long time, not a very long time, but I am certainly at midlife, and no politician has ever called me up and said, Dr. Christopher Gennari, or Christopher Gennari before I was Dr. Christopher Gennari, you're a smart guy, or you're a good guy, or you're a citizen. I have a bunch of things. What? Could you tell me what your opinions are? I have never had anyone from the House of Representatives do that. Even in the mail. They send me mail and they say all this stuff they did. Okay, but that's not necessarily what I would want. So, republics are weird. Representatives of the patrician families plus male citizen plebeians formed the Senate, which is an advisory group. It doesn't actually have powers. It doesn't actually have institutional powers. It's a body for discussion of old, wise, rich men, which is what Senate means. Senatas means old men. So when you look at the Senate today and you say, although they're all old, well, that means it was named correctly. But in the Senate were also the tribunes, the representatives of the people. So leadership in the Roman Republic is like the Greek assemblies, oration. You had to be able to speak and convince people, to sway their emotions. You had to have charisma. You had to get them to side with you. But unlike the Greek democracies and unlike the Greek assemblies, where all you needed was 51% of the vote, or 50.1% of the vote, you had to have a majority. That's not how the Roman Republic worked. The Roman Republic worked on consensus, general agreement. Why? Because remember who the Senate is. The Senate is representatives of the richest, oldest families in Rome. They all know each other. They're all related. They might have competing interests, but they also have similar interests. So the idea is to slow down government, to slow down change, because these guys are very conservative. They don't want change. You had to get consensus. You had to get everyone to agree, which means, like Odysseus, you had to be able to build, negotiate agreements, especially among different factions who have competing interests. The majority should get its way, but the minority shouldn't get run over. In a democracy, the worry of a democracy since the ancient Greeks is that the majority will use its power as a majority to always vote for itself, that there is no protection for minorities. In any way, it could be racial, it could be gendered, it could be whatever, economic, that the idea is that whoever could get to 50.1% would always have all the power. And if you weren't in that 50.1%, you were going to get run over. Now, that is a fear of democracies. We don't see too much evidence all the time of that happening. Like in the Greek cities, the democracies never vote to tax rich people out of existence and take all their stuff, like the French Revolution did. But the Athenian democracy didn't. But either way, what a republic does is protect those minorities. So the majority gets what it wants. But the minority gets protections because the Senate has to speak with one voice. It needs a consensus. It needs everyone to agree, even if they don't like the thing. The majority gets what it wants, but the minority gets protections. And so you have to be a consensus builder. You can't command people. You can't force them. So you need oration. You need to be a talker. You need to be charismatic. You need to build consensus. And then you need wealth, generosity. You need the ability to get your followers jobs and better lives. We kind of talked about this with the assemblies. When we talked about Queen Christina and the queens and the building of parties and the such, you have to be able to take care of those who follow you. You got to get them jobs. You got to get them better lives. So we get early and very personal parties. Crassus is important because he comes from a rich family, and he's the richest man in Rome. So he could buy people. He could buy positions. He could buy an army. He could buy stuff that made people be loyal to him. So since leaders needed to get elected, though, they needed plebeian supporters, and plebeians needed jobs, promotions, favorable loans, health care, officerships in the army or the government. They needed legal aid. There's always stuff that costs money if you're poor. Poor people, the problem for poor people, the overwhelming problem for poor people is it's expensive to be poor. There's always costs. And so in a world without banks, without loans, there are loans, but they're usury. The patricians needed people to vote for them, and the plebeians needed patrician help. And so the Roman system puts those together. Patricians need to deliver patronage, or they have no supporters. So the patricians led the republic, but the republic didn't belong to them. And you better not forget it. Those who think that the republic belonged to them, like a certain guy named Caesar, gets stabbed. Caesar's not the first. He wasn't the last. You better not forget that people had a say, that the people mattered. So the patricians led the republic, but it was a stewardship. It doesn't belong to them. So your leadership is, no matter how great you are, there's always that limitation. It's not yours. It's not you. So what does this mean? 1, the Roman Republic was open to talent. And because of war, constantly willing to innovate to find good leadership. 2 of the most famous examples are Cincinnatus and Scipio Africanus. So the Roman Republic, unlike a king, where the king is the leader, the king is the general, the king is the authority. The Republic is made up of a group of individuals, tribunes and senators, officers. And so it's open to the constant ferment of people rising. Now, most jobs are going to go to fellow patricians, but there are tribunes, there are plebeians who rise through the ranks. Cincinnatus, he is a senator, and he was liked by both the patricians and the plebeians. And so when there was a war, they called him basically out of retirement. They called him out of retirement. They gave him dictatorial powers for a year. I mean, you could do whatever you want. You could murder anybody you need to murder. You could do anything. You could change everything. You have to save Rome. And so there is no limit on your authority. A diktat. He won the war in 15 days because people were willing to follow him. He puts together a 30,000-man army, goes off, fights the battle, wins the war, treats his defeated nicely, which is, not a thing Romans generally do. Wins, comes back to the Senate. He could have ruled for another 350 some days as a dictator. But he doesn't. He hands over his sword and goes back to his farm. He gives up power. And he becomes kind of mythological. He becomes a legend. Washington, if you go to the Smithsonian Museums in Washington, D.C., Washington has two sculptures, statues of him as Cincinnatus. There are artworks called the American Cincinnatus. That is how Washington was portrayed in art and in popular culture. The man who could have been king. He really couldn't have, but he could have been a dictator. In fact, his army asked him to be a dictator, and he said no. The man who could have been Caesar is Washington, who said no, thus becoming Cincinnatus. And that became the model for the next 100 years, 120 years or so, right? 150 years. No other president had more than 2 terms because Washington didn't have 2 terms, and nobody considered themselves better than Washington. Scipio Africanus was elected general at 25. 25, he was a baby. There were officers who had been in the military longer than Scipio had been alive. But the reason why he was elected general at 25 was because the Spanish allies during the Punic Wars against Carthage, in the war in Spain, in Hispania, the Spanish allies had fought under Scipio's father and Scipio's uncle. And they had both been killed. And so when Rome sent a guy, Joe showed up and said, "Hey, I'm Joe. I'm in charge now." The Spanish allies looked at him and said, "You're not a Scipio?" And he said, "No, I'm a Joe." And they said, "Get the F out of here. We're not fighting for you. We don't know who you are. We made all these deals. We got all these promises from Scipio the dad and then Scipio the uncle. We want a Scipio." And so the Roman Republic found one of Scipio the dad's sons, said, "You are now general." He's like, "I'm 25. "Yeah, well, you're general now. Go to Spain and win." And he went to Spain and said, "Hi, I'm Scipio." And the Spanish ally said, "Okay, are you going to adhere to all the deals your dad and then your uncle made? All the treaties, all the promises?" And Scipio said, "Well, if my dad made them, then yes, of course I'm going to do that. My dad wasn't a liar. My dad wasn't going to betray you." So, and that's exactly what the Spanish allies wanted. They wanted the promise of a son. In their world, a son upholds the word of their father. So they wanted a Roman son. They didn't want a Roman tribune. They wanted a Roman son to uphold the word of a Roman father. And so Scipio was made general. This showed the Roman Republic was willing to change. It was willing to give power. Now, Scipio is so good at general, he becomes known as Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. Africa at the time was not the continent. Africa meant the place where Carthage was. So it's really Scipio, the conqueror of Carthage. But Africanus is a cool name. You had to be able, number 2, you had to be able to sway the rich who wanted auctoritas. Auctoritas. They want authority. This is the word we get from it, but it means like respect, more than command, more than control. They want people, when you enter the room, they want people to stand up. You want the respect of being you. That's auctoritas. And the rich people want that. That's the thing they're always competing with. Who gets to be consul? Who gets to be the leader of the Senate? Who gets to be general? So you had to be able to sway the rich, who all want to be this like leading man of Rome, but also impress the middle and working classes who want dignitas. No one, if you're a worker, no one's going to come in. You're covered in dust and poop and whatever. If you're a farmer, right? You're covered in dirt. No one's going to stand up for you. But what you want to feel is that you belong in that room. And you're treated as if you belong in that room. You may not be the leader of that room, but you want to know you belong in there. And that's dignitas, where we get dignity from, respect. Right? Notice there are different kinds of respect, auctoritas and dignitas. And they're different things. The middle and working classes don't want auctoritas. They wouldn't know what to do with it. And the rich people already have. They can buy dignitas. They can buy better clothes. They could buy the room. They could buy the food served in the room. They could buy dignitas. So you had to be able to sway these two groups who want different things. And 3, power came from institutional legitimacy. The Senate says, you're general. We voted for you. The people, the tribunes, agree. You are general. You are leader. You are a leader. You are you are elected tribune. That gave you huge institutional legitimacy. But also the support of the people, quote unquote. This gives a huge power to success. The people are with you. The institutions are with you. But it can also disappear quickly. Because if you lose the support of, quote, the people, the institutional legitimacy goes away too. All of it just drains away. And you can watch it. You can feel it. Less people show up to hear you speak. The people who do show up to hear you speak are more likely to be people you paid, you found jobs for, so they're loyal to you, or they're dirtier, they're poorer, they're less respectable, which means they can help you less and they need more aid. That's not exactly, that just means you're on the downturn. You know? So, the Roman Republic gave individuals who were not like born to be leader huge abilities to be powerful, but they could also take it away really quickly. So Hannibal. Now Hannibal is a Carthaginian general. He is not a leader of Rome. But he becomes this kind of model for Roman leadership. Why? Because Hannibal, in his invasion of Italy, killed in about a year and a half, 10% of all Roman men in 3 major battles. He never lost in Italy. He laid siege to Rome. He came the closest of anyone to destroying Rome during the Republic. And so the idea for Roman leadership was you had to be better than him. He's our enemy. He's our greatest enemy. So if you want to be a great leader, you have to be better than our best enemy. It's Steph Curry needing to be better than LeBron James. It's LeBron James needing to be better than Kobe. Kobe needing to be better than Michael Jordan. You have to be better than your rival for you to be great. And so we get a couple of quotes about him mostly from Polybius, a historian of the Punic Wars. Hannibal never required others to do what he could not or would not do himself. So what made him great? He asked of his soldiers, he asked of his servants, he asked of his friends, he asked of people only the things he would do himself. So he led by example. He led. He didn't command. A bigger quote from Polybius is, "It is remarkable and very cogent proof of Hannibal's having been by nature a real leader and far superior to anyone else in statesmanship, that though he spent 17 years in the field," meaning at war, in Spain, in Italy, in Africa, passed through so many barbarous countries, Spain, Gaul, France, and employed to aid him in desperate and extraordinary enterprises numbers of men of different nations and languages, people who should not be loyal to him. They don't speak his language, they don't know his culture, they're not the same race, they have their own goals, which are different than Carthaginian goals. The Gauls, Gauls, the Gauls and the Spaniards, the Spaniards, the Iberians, all have different goals, all want different things than the Carthaginians do. And how do you even get these people to agree on anything? They don't speak the same language. Despite that, no one ever dreamt of conspiring against him, nor was he ever deserted by those who had once joined him or submitted to him. What does this tell us about Polybius is a Roman talking to other Romans about how to be a Roman by using Hannibal, by using your enemy. And so a real leader has loyal followers. The more numbers and the more diverse they are, the greater the leader. That's leadership. That if people follow you because they are loyal to you, even when they are different, even when they are diverse, even when they have their own separate goals from yours. Now, after the Punic Wars, Rome got rich. Rome won the Punic Wars. It took over Sicily. It took over northern Africa. It took over Spain. It consolidated Italy itself. The Roman Republic got rich, and the rich got super rich. They brought in tens of thousands of slaves, which they really hadn't had before. And the Roman economy became very income unequal. Roman senators start building giant palaces out in the burbs, in the suburbs, latifundia, these giant 1,000-acre plantations staffed by slaves. They don't want to live in Rome anymore with the poor people. They'll go to the Senate and then they'll leave. They don't want to see where before they lived among the poor. Now they're rich enough to separate themselves out. And that causes problems because the needs of the rich are increasingly, as Rome got richer and more powerful, the needs of the rich were different than the needs of the poor. And a good leader before, say, 150 BC, understood that and had to build a consensus between all those different groups. By the time we get to the end of the Punic Wars, the rich and the poor are going their separate ways. The poor are in some ways getting poorer, and the rich are getting stupidly richer. And then there's the populare, the people who see that this is a problem. Populare is where we get populists. And they're called populare because they want to be popular. They go to the people. They are patricians in this case. They are rich guys who don't want to play by the rules of the Senate. They will appeal directly to the people. See, remember when we said Rome isn't a democracy, but it thinks in a way that the people are sovereign in order to get them to be part of the situation? Well, what if you just went to the people to elect leaders? What if you bypassed the Senate? What if you said the Senate doesn't matter? And you just went to the people and you had the people do plebiscites, just voting leaders. So the populari rise when income inequality was breaking the Roman Republic. And they proposed themselves as reformers. They were going to take money from the rich and give it to the poor. Bernie Sanders is a populari. So they saw themselves as reformers. And that's the Gracchi, Gracchi, the Gracchi. But patricians saw them as like class betrayers because the Gracchi are rich. The Gracchis are patricians. But the Gracchi see themselves as reformers. The patricians see them as betrayers and as revolutionaries trying to steal power, trying to usurp the Senate, trying to replace the rich people. And so what they did was murder the Gracchi. The rich people murdered the reformers. They murdered the populari. And that said, Rome would not reform. The result of that is in the 100s, you got 3 generations of civil war. You got 100 years of civil war because the plebeians, wanting dignitas, wanting dignity, turned to warlord patricians, private armies, and eventually, under Caesar, waged war on the Senate itself. In a century of civil war. We have Sulla versus Marius, and Sulla will win that, and he'll murder rich people. He will murder patricians who are against him. He will murder his enemies in the Senate, which made the plebeians happy because now they got money. Because what he did was murder some rich people, take their money, take their land, give it to the poor people. Sulla was perfectly happy to buy loyalty from the plebeians. A generation later, you get Caesar versus Pompey. Pompey represents the Senate. Caesar is on his own. Caesar defeats Pompey, takes over the Senate. Now, Caesar doesn't have a murderous rampage through the Senate the way Sulla did. But fearing that Caesar was going to be like Sulla, the Senate murdered him, led by Brutus. Now, Brutus is important because Brutus is the ancestor of the original Brutus who founded the Roman Republic. Think of Brutus who led the stabbing of Caesar as Washington. But like the great, 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 great grandson of Washington. Think of it that way. That's who he is. His ancestor is a king killer. His ancestor is the founder of the Republic. So how can he allow Caesar to take it over and make himself a king? How can Marius Brutus, this young man, allow Caesar to undo what his great ancestor did? So I always feel bad for Brutus because Dante will put him in the lowest level of hell. He's always treated as a betrayer. That Caesar was this great guy, but Caesar was taking over the Senate. Caesar was a revolutionary. And Brutus was trapped by his ancestral honor, his family's history. So Caesar's murdered, Pompey is murdered by the Egyptians. That left an army, and that army split between Caesar's army split between two of Caesar's loyal lieutenants, Octavian, who was Caesar's nephew and heir, and Mark Antony, Caesar's best lieutenant. And they got into a civil war with each other. And so in each of these systems, in each of these civil wars, you have rich people looking for auctoritas, authority, and individuals, regular folks, plebeians looking for dignitas. And they were willing to join any of these groups that promised it to them. And the problem was that since the Senate had murdered the Gracchi, the Senate told people it wasn't going to reform. So in each of these cases, Sulla versus Marius, Caesar versus Pompey, Octavian versus Mark Antony, the Senate loses. The guys who lead the murder of Caesar are all killed themselves later on by Octavian and Mark Antony. Cato and Brutus. Cicero will be murdered. And though he was kind of wishy-washy, he was, trying to play both sides. He was pro-Senate, but he hated Mark Antony. Mark Antony had him murdered. What about the American Republic? Well, like the Roman Republic, it was formed after rebellion against the king. And you have to understand, the American founding fathers had read their histories. They knew their classics. They didn't want to be Athens. They, from the very beginning, were looking at the Roman Republic, not the empire. A lot of people forget that the Roman Empire is not the entire thing of Rome. The Roman Empire is only half. So Americans hate kings, but we're also scared of democracies. Look at our system. Most of the leading rebels in America of the 1770s were rich pre-revolutionary leaders. 44 of the 56 people who signed the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. John Hancock was at one point the richest man in North America. So was Benjamin Franklin. So the system they created, the Constitution we eventually got, is a system that created to keep power in the hands of elites, but built a system of checks and balances against those elites of competing institutions. So the president, who is the only figure elected by the entire country, is balanced by two houses of Congress, one of which is appointed, one of which is elected, and an unelected judiciary, which is also balancing off these different groups. So the American Republican people is like the Roman Republic. Its model, it treats rich and poor citizens equally, but it concentrates power with the elites. The president is not elected by electoral vote, but by the electoral college, the popular vote, I mean. The president is not elected by popular vote, but by the electoral college. The Senate was not elected by popular vote. It's appointed by the states. The Senate's job is to represent the states, not the people. The representatives, the House of Representatives, are like the tribunes, but they only have a 2-year term. So they're constantly needing to get reelected. There was no standing army. The power of money is in Congress, not in the president. Southern states could count slaves as people, that's the 3/5 compromise, which means conservative and rural areas had more power than they should have. And the only propertied white men could vote. So a lot of the men in the cities didn't have a right to vote. Immigrants don't have a right to vote. So what is leadership like in the American Republic? And like in Rome, you had to be someone who could appeal to different desires of different groups. Western settlers who wanted land and protection from Native American attacks, or protection from the law when they attacked Native Americans. Urban workers and merchants who wanted safe trade with Europe and stable financial systems. Southern planters who wanted credit for land so they could buy and sell and get debt because you don't have the cash. So you're buying all of your property, you're buying your enslaved people, your labor with credit. You needed credit, but they also wanted the right to violence versus enslaved people. They didn't want police to come and say, you're not supposed to hurt people. They wanted to be able to do what they wanted to do to their own property as they saw it, whether or not those property was actually human beings. Rural farmers need resources, infrastructure like canals. They need credit because they have to buy a lot of their stuff on credit because the seasons don't quite line up with when your money comes in and out. They need markets, so stuff has to be safe. People have to be safe to travel to these markets. Goods have to be safe from theft. The wealthy wanted power and prestige, and they are happy, since we know about duels, to kill each other for it. If you ever listen to the musical Hamilton, that ends in a duel. So the wealthy want power and prestige and are happy to kill each other. So a good leader is many different types of leader. Lincoln had his stories and his parables. You see this in the movie Lincoln. Jackson had his masculinity and his generalship. You knew Jackson was tough. So even as he got older, you respected his toughness because his toughness was his resume, on his face, on his body. Jefferson and Madison had their philosophy and their erudition. The Constitution is in many ways Madison's creation of checks and balances and making all these different pieces work. And then there's Washington, who had his Romanesque style of stoic republicanism. He becomes the model. He's emotionless. Even people at the time wrote that Washington didn't laugh. He's a stoic Republican. He's sculpted and painted as Cincinnatus, as a Roman senator, as a Roman patrician. Washington is constantly seen as this idealized new Roman in the early American Republic. So this kind of leadership reflected your time, your place, your need to appeal to lots of different people. So President Obama, for example, could appeal to progressives to build a more liberal, erudite America. The Yes We Can. And if you've never seen the Will I Am video of the Yes We Can speech, where Obama in 2007 is talking about we can do all these great things. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It is this appeal to progressivism that is just, as a liberal, amazing. But he could also appeal to African American trauma following the racist mass murder in Charleston. Even getting up in front of this whole church and singing Amazing Grace. He's not a singer. He's not Aretha Franklin. But he was able to give that audience what it needed. That catharsis. That was leadership. He didn't come and say, I'm sorry, bad things happened to you. He was able to emote with them pathos and catharsis. President Trump can appeal to religious social conservatives, despite not being religious or a social conservative. He doesn't share any of the religious rights, religious conservatives' way of thinking about the world. President Trump is a New York businessman of the drug-fueled 1980s. You couldn't be farther away from an Alabama Baptist. But who has the Alabama Baptist voted for the last 10 years? President Trump. So he's able to connect with them. He could appeal to union workers despite being a billionaire the billionaire owner of an anti-union construction firm who has a reputation for not paying contractors. And yet the workers of those contractors who were not getting paid because President Trump didn't pay them voted for him. So both President Obama and President Trump are not one thing. They can't be one thing. If you want to lead a republic, you're constantly balancing. You must appeal to the many and gain their support. And America is too big, too diverse to be a monolith. The Roman Republic at its height was the same. There are too many people, too many languages, too many needs for you to just say, I'm in charge and I'm going to stay in charge forever. Now, we'll talk a bit when we do Divine Right about the Roman Empire. When you get somebody who says, I'm going to stay in charge forever. But that was at the end of 100 years of the republic ripping itself apart. So what people wanted was stability. They didn't want change. Okay. So we did the Roman Republic and the American Republic. And I hope you see just how hard it is to be a leader in these systems. The more people involved, the harder it is to balance all of these different groups and to keep everyone happy, or at least happy enough to keep you in charge. All right, be safe. Take care. I'll see you soon.